Okay, let me welcome all of you. Thank you very much for joining this session, which is basically Breakout Session 5 as part of the InsuResilience Global Partnership Annual Forum. And where we will have a deeper dive into some of the inspiring stories of change, in particular from a gender perspective. My name is Sven Harmeling. I work with CARE International as Global Policy Lead on Climate Change and Resilience, and CARE is one of the organizations chairing the IGP Gender Working Group jointly with the Government of Canada, and so it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be facilitating and moderating this session. Before I give you a brief overview of the running order and what we want to achieve, and we'll introduce the speakers, just a bit of housekeeping. Please go to the next slide. Of course, the usual aspects, please use the chat to introduce yourself and ask questions that can help us monitor your questions and then pick them up later on. It's indicated by the moderator that you should raise your hand during the Q&A, which we'll come back to a bit later. Please use the hand button on the far right end of the screen. Once I call on you, please use the microphone and camera button, of course, to be live, and also to minimize the presentation, for example, and making the speaker thumbnails bigger. Click the minus at the top right end of the screen. And another point is also to restore the presentation after minimizing it. Please use the button next to the hand on the far right button. It's only, so just to familiarize you a little bit with some of the modalities and features of this platform. The sessions are being recorded because we also want to provide others the possibility to watch them as well as work with the results of this. If you do not want to be recorded, kindly, I would like to kindly ask you to turn off your microphone and camera, so that's the best way for that. And of course, while you're not talking, please, turn them off anyway. And then there's also a possibility to post additional questions in Risk Talk afterwards. www.insuresilience.org/risktalk. So that's another possibility to engage. So let's keep it with that for the housekeeping. Before I hand over to the first speaker, I would briefly introduce the session and everyone, of course, who will play a contributing role here. So basically, we will focus on stories of change related to gender and climate and disaster risk, finance and insurance in this session. By reflecting on concrete case studies, we will have 3 panelists presenting those, and this will stimulate an interactive discussion, we hope, on why a gender-smart approach to CDRFI is important, what is needed to drive forward a sector-wide transformation, and how to become an agent for change, so that investments, projects, approaches in the area of climate and disaster risk, finance and insurance can be more impactful, can be more successful, because they would be more gender transformative, but of course also by that contribute to increase gender equality. Our first speaker is Ms. Akosita Drova. She's an extended term consultant with the World Bank's Fiji country office, focusing on disaster risk finance. Prior to joining the World Bank in 2017, she worked for Fiji's Ministry of Finance for 25 years, working on strengthening public finance management to the implementation of financial management reforms. In her presentation, she will speak on the recent research on gender and climate disaster risk finance insurance in Pacific Island nations. She will be followed by Ms. Sarah Favrichon. She's a component lead on climate risk insurance and GIZ project, Adaptation of Agricultural Value Chains to Climate Change in Madagascar. In her work, she addresses the challenges faced by smallholder farmers in accessing adequate microinsurance products. And in her intervention, she will share learnings from the field on integrating gender approaches in risk transfer instruments. And then as a third speaker, we will hear from Ms. Sumaiya Kabir. She's a consortium coordinator for CARE-led forecast-based early action project in Bangladesh. The project is called Scaling Up Forecast-Based Action and Learning. Previously, Sumaiya has worked on resilience and gender in Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Nepal. She will be sharing results from a recent study by CARE and the START network on gender-inclusive disaster risk financing, which uses a missing voices approach to examine how gender is integrated into various stages of disaster risk finance programs, both in Philippines and Bangladesh. So that's it for the brief introduction of the three speakers. And I would now like to hand over to Akosita to take the floor, and to the colleagues from the InsuResilience Secretariat to please put up the presentation.
Thank you, Sven. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you that are tuned in. I wish to welcome you all to this session where I will be sharing with you the gender assessment of climate and disaster risk finance insurance in the Pacific Island countries, an assessment that was undertaken by the World Bank Group in collaboration with InsuResilience Global Partnership. This assessment explored how existing CDRFI policies and instruments in the Pacific Island countries have integrated gender-responsive approaches to date. The assessment also tries to highlight key areas for further in-depth research into gender and CDRFI in the Pacific. Climate and disaster risk threatens the well-being of the region's population and the fiscal stability of our Pacific Island countries. And given our vulnerability to natural disasters, the annualized economic losses caused by disasters in the Pacific countries are estimated at 1.075 billion, which equates to nearly 5% of for the Pacific countries in 2019. And out of this amount, almost half, which is 49.6%, are tropical cyclones alone. On this slide, I would like to briefly highlight the case for gender focus in the Pacific Island countries. Generally, women and girls are more likely to die in a disaster, and deaths by gender can vary by country and disaster types. There is gender inequalities in terms of access to finance. There is also a lower labor force participation rate of women in the Pacific. Legal gender differences persist between women and men, which impacts their economic empowerment and resilience to disasters and to assets that are available to be drawn on for recovering from a disaster. And from the slide, you can see that Vanuatu scored 58.1 out of 100 in the Women's Business and Law Index, which is the lowest in the Pacific. And lastly, there's a significant risk of violence against women and girls after a disaster. And in 2011, after two tropical cyclones hit Vanuatu, there was a 300% increase in new domestic violence cases. This slide shows the different financing or budgetary instruments that are used or can be used in the Pacific Islands to address different types of risks from a layering perspective. And all the CDRFI instruments at the macro, micro, and meso level in the Pacific Island countries have the potential to integrate gender-sensitive planning and gender-responsive actions, as well as to ensure the participation of women in diverse roles within the implementation of the instrument. The next two slides briefly discusses the findings of the study. There are a number of entry points that the researchers identified through which gender can be considered in policies and regulations, which inform macro level schemes that are gender responsive, as well as inform market developments of gender smart CDRFI. At the policy level, there are some evidences that indicate that gender has been considered in policies, although limited, and there are instances where gender was never considered at all. At the macro level, there was only one regional climate and disaster risk insurance product available at the time of the research, and this relates to the Pacific Catastrophe Risk Insurance Company, or PCRIC in short, their sovereign parametric insurance product. And at the micro and meso levels, there were no CDRI at the time of the research. However, reliable information was gathered that a micro product was launched after the research. And to conclude, there are a number of recommendations that have emerged from the study, which, if implemented, are envisaged to enhance efforts by national and regional stakeholders, and of course, development partners, to address gender differential climate and disaster risks in the Pacific Island countries through CDRF solutions. These recommendations can only be effective if policymakers in each Pacific Island country set a national commitment to integrate gender considerations in their national policies, plans, and roadmaps. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is a very brief snapshot of the gender assessment of CDRFIs in the Pacific Island countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akosita, for kicking off our session with these insights from Pacific, and there's definitely a lot of food for thought and for further discussion. Before we get to that, I would like to hand over to the next speaker, which is Sarah, providing us some more insights from experience in Madagascar. Please, Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Sven. So I'll be going way more into micro level and not so much on the macro level. I'll be speaking about a project in Madagascar, which we are implementing at the moment with GIZ, and it's BMZ funded. The project is based in the south of Madagascar and southeast, where the climate risks are mainly drought in the south, and on the east coast, it's going to be more cyclones and floods. And just to give an idea, it's about 80% of the population, which is really active in agriculture sector and very informal. Today, we'll be focusing a bit on how we try to address adaptation in the agriculture value chains with a focus on women, and more specifically also with a deep dive into the climate risk insurance product that has been developed for one of the value chains. So I'll try to give a bit more details about this and how we try to really include a gender smart approach in the product conception. The first thing we did was to have a very in-depth analysis of the situation of the value chains on an economic level, environmental level, climate risk level, but also inclusion. And the findings were that women in the south of Madagascar are very underrepresented in the cash crops we were interested in. They're also more impacted by climate change than men, specifically when it comes to daily life, so like picking water, for example, or dealing with just finding food for the kids. They're also obviously going to be less likely to be present in trainings and have access to resources, but also they have a bit more specific knowledge about adaptation, even though they wouldn't call it that way probably, but they know a bit more about how to, diversify the crops they're producing, for example, just to be able to have some food at any time in the year. So the idea for us was really to look at the climate risk management cycle from preparedness to reduction of risk and to transfer of risk and adapt it to women's needs. So maybe to start a bit with that cycle, what we looked at in terms of preparedness, for example, was to say women don't have access to the climate information or agrometeorological information that might be useful to deal with climate risk. So we need to have some specific information and sensitization that is gender smart. So we try to adapt also the crop calendars, have some women trainers for the sensitization and so on. These adapted crop calendars, for example, were really useful to get a right start in the season and really adapt to when the season was changing and, for example, was delayed, be able to actually access that information and use it in the field. Also, what we did was to implement some climate field goals where new or adapted cultivation techniques were used. And there we had quite often some women as lead for these climate fields. And that was also really useful to keep the information be spread and also be more implemented by women because they were inspired by those women leaders. Obviously, this is more on the climate reduction and preparedness side, but we also needed to have a bit more financial knowledge and like financial education for women to be able to deal and to see themselves as active, business in agriculture. So we implemented that farmer business school approach and tried to really include more women or include men and women in the household, which also made the difference because in most cases only men would be actually participating in those trainings. And the last point was obviously to say, if we prepare, if we reduce risk, we also need maybe to have some transfer options. And that's where we try to develop a climate risk insurance product. This climate risk insurance product was piloted only for one value chain, which is groundnut. And the idea was really to adapt the product to whatever the needs were. In terms of climate risk, obviously for groundnut, the risk was pretty much the same for everyone. We don't really have much differences. But then if we look at the financial parameters, so for example, the sum insured or the capacity to pay actually for the product, it's obviously different if you have a man that has maybe 2-3 hectares and a woman, which in most cases has only half a hectare, for example. So obviously her interest for the product might be there, but it needs to be adapted to her financial needs. So that was one of the main findings we had, was really that when we suggested the first product, the prototype, they were like, it's interesting, but it's too expensive. It's too much for me. I need to have something that is smaller and adapted to my needs. So we really tried to customize the product characteristic to their financial situation. Obviously, on the sensitization aspect, you can see on the left side one example of what we were doing. It was really tested also for women, because at first we had very typically a man buying insurance, and obviously it doesn't really give a good example or an idea of how women can actually be included as well, and that they are also entitled to buy insurance. On the contrary, maybe to credit, whereas women without property titles, they wouldn't be able to access it. In that case, the barriers weren't there, but it was more a barrier in the head that they weren't thinking of actually be able to buy insurance. In the first year, that was just finished last year, the first pilot year, we had 40% women in the clients, 60% men, which I think is quite interesting. And we're really looking forward to see for the second piloting, which is going to happen now in November, to see if we keep that number or if we have any changes, for example. These were a few findings from the climate risk insurance aspect. Now, maybe a few thoughts for discussion. What we saw also is that we need to strengthen the role of women where they are active in the value chain, to really have them be even more prominently active and be more professional in those parts. Also, the mentoring aspect was mentioned as one thing. I was talking about the climate field leaders as women. This is also very interesting. One more point that is very specific to climate risk insurance, we try to have digital payments be possible, so digital payouts or digital payment for the premium. And this works when you already have a phone, but in many cases, actually, women weren't having access to a phone, or they weren't just having any network, for example. So that's one point. Either we should work more on how to have more digital access, or also find distributors that are very close to women or close to the localities where we offer the product. And one last point, I think, which is quite interesting and I haven't mentioned on my slide, is that we also realized that in terms of climate and disaster risk finance, insurance was one aspect, but we needed to look also at some other products, for example, savings or credits, and kind of find a way to make them also more accessible to women. And one point that we are discussing right now, which I think is interesting, is that there is a specific agricultural fund in Madagascar, and we're thinking of having a specific package for adaptation to help with the start, the first investment you have to make when you try to adapt your business or your activity. You need to buy some specific seeds, make some specific investments, and that's like a hurdle to actually start with climate adaptation. And that's where maybe some type of finance mechanism could come in to help that first step be overcome by women. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. Another set of very interesting insights from this practical experience in Madagascar. Sumaiya, you next with a final input on the experience in Bangladesh in particular, please.
Thanks very much, Sven. So I'm presenting a study which was done by Start Network and CARE, and it was facilitated by Practical Action Consulting. So this looked at gender inclusion and gender mainstreaming in disaster risk financing, and particularly looking at, this disaster risk which is available ahead of disasters, in anticipation of disasters. So you know that there is a large shift nowadays in before a disaster, having financing available for communities beforehand, so they're able to take action and reduce the potential damages. So this study looked at how we bring in the voices of women, how we consider women, how we make disaster risk finance more gender friendly. So the approach we use, the missing voices approach, which is used by Practical Action, it allows us to have a more in-depth understanding of the needs or priorities of marginalized groups. Through a local partner who has presence on ground, who has understanding of the different groups, of the different dynamics, power structures, and also was able to help us identify who the marginalized groups were. The analysis, which is not mentioned in the slide, was also done using START networks, disaster risk financing building blocks. So mainly looking at it from a risk analysis perspective, contingency plans, and then financing, and how gender and inclusion is addressed in these. First of all, around, also part of the methodology, in Bangladesh, where we looked at the different groups which are affected in river erosion, riverbank erosion particularly. There's a lot of rivers in Bangladesh, and in the northern areas, the locations tend to, the banks tend to fall off, and these really affect people. They lose their homes, they lose their agricultural lands, and a lot of people become homeless or have to keep constantly moving to find new locations. So in riverbank erosion, we particularly focused on adolescent groups, on the elderly, lactating mothers, homeless, and extremely poor households. In Philippines, we looked more at cyclones. So the vulnerable groups were persons living with disabilities, transgender, female farmers, female pensioners. Findings around risk analytics, basically, when we moved to analyzing risk at databases which are available, overall, we find that there is a recognition for the importance and the need to mainstream gender. There are practical guidances available, and there are some sex and age disaggregated data being collected, although not quite clear whether it's demographic data or specific to the projects being implemented. There's a lot more overall that can be. In risk analysis, vulnerability is really important. So these are existing vulnerabilities we find, which really define how women are represented in data. There's a need to move away from larger data sets and move to more qualitative information. So this is, in the margins of data, is where we find more of the information of the vulnerable groups. The soft is very important to understand what is happening to women and other marginalized groups as well. So it's important to hear their experiences and go beyond just the average differences between men and women. Thresholds and triggers which we set to basically trigger early action needs to be a lot more softer. It needs to not be based on data, not be based simply on the definition of the hazard. Contingency planning, we find that a lot of it has to do with an individual or a marginalized household's access to take the action as well. Information is very, very important. So a lot of the households don't have lack the knowledge or the experiences or the coping strategies in order to really take early actions as well. Local groups are very important over here in ensuring that earlier action is taken. A lot of the groups that we found that they needed more time to take actions as well. Specific concerns as well for marginalized groups. They tend to be more susceptible or are at risk of gender-based violence. So these are also certain considerations that we need to take when designing contingency plans. Finally, around financing, it's very important again to understand the different needs of the groups and allocate resources accordingly. And it's important to allocate resources to also identify what the specific or different needs are of these groups as well. Existing gaps in social protection is also important to be identified. And we found also that cash assistance seems to work. It's a more dignified approach, and it allows the households to make decisions on what type of early actions to take as well. Important to have gender in feedback loops as well, in hearing the views and the feedback from the most vulnerable groups. Finally, recommendations. It's important to set very simple gender targets and resource them properly. So we need to have the manpower, the resources to capture the needs of the different groups. It needs ultimately to be locally led, and also the monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems also need to be able to capture the gender information. Important to have the voices of the marginalized people in governance structures around disaster risk financing. I end here. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for this additional input, and yeah, there's a lot in all of those presentations we can come back to. Before I will pose the first questions to Akosita, I just would like to encourage the participants again that if you have questions, please put them into the chat, so I can monitor them and then bring them to the table, or maybe even call on you to provide these questions directly. Akosita, I think in terms of the inputs you provide and the experience shared from Fiji, I would like to come back on this with two questions basically. On the one hand, can you elaborate a bit more what actions has this research identified that have or can be taken at the policy and macro level to basically to inspire gender smart action for resilience in the Pacific Island countries and beyond, but basically take it to the next level, so to say, and have an even scaled up approach of transformation. And the second question relates to that I think overall there have been some recent developments related to CDRFI in the Pacific since this research was completed, and if there's some updates you can share from that, I think it would also be quite interesting. So yeah, over to you for these first questions.
Thank you, Sven. With regards to the first question, the research has identified a number of entry points, both at the policy and the macro level. And firstly, we have the view that policymakers can play an important role as change agents to inspire gender smart actions. And their key role would be to ensure that gender is considered in policies and regulations, which will inform macro level schemes that are gender responsive, as well as inform market developments of gender smart CDRFI, both at the macro and micro level. And having said this, gender responsive climate and disaster risk financing strategies, planning and budgeting is one of the key entry points that were identified through the research that was undertaken. And there was no Pacific Island country with a disaster risk financing strategy at the time of the research. So there is clearly greater scope for the formulation of these strategies in the Pacific Island countries. Integrating gender consideration in these strategies is critical so that it sets a national commitment to gender smart actions for resilience, and to also provide a roadmap towards how this can be operationalized in practice. In our research, we found that while all Pacific Island countries have a government agency that is driving the gender agenda, they are not necessarily involved in shaping the CDRFI related policies, whether these are climate change policies or national disaster risk management policies. And this may be a reason why women-specific climate risks are not effectively accounted for in our policies. With regards to your second question, yes, there were some recent developments related to this climate and disaster risk finance insurance in the Pacific. since the research was completed. And I could say there were two new developments. Firstly, in terms of disaster risk financing strategy, the government of Tonga had its strategy approved recently. And this was after the analysis was undertaken. And Tonga is the first Pacific Island country with a disaster risk financing strategy, although Samoa and possibly Fiji are currently working in formulating their disaster risk financing strategy. Our team was involved in the development of this strategy for Tonga, and I could say that they had addressed gender considerations in terms of both its development process and strategy content, as the Ministry of Finance, which was spearheading the formulation of this document, involved the Department of Women in the formulation of this strategy to ensure that gender issues were considered during the development process. The second development that also took place since the research was undertaken was the launch of a new Pacific Insurance and Climate Adaptation, a micro insurance, a parametric insurance, which was launched by the UN CDF together with Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. And this was in response to the gap in the market for climate and risk insurance more generally. The micro insurance targeted farmers, fishers, and market vendors. And at the end of last month, 500 members had signed up. The launch was in August, and at the end of last month, there were about 500 members that had signed up, and out of these 500, 20% were women, and this number is expected to go up significantly. So those are the two developments that have taken place after the researchers went.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's very interesting in terms of those updates from the region. I would like to, before I pick on the question that has come in the chat, I would like to first turn to the other speakers for some follow-up questions. Sarah, I think the first question I want to pose is whether you can elaborate a bit more on how you have taken a gender-smart approach to increase resilience, looking beyond insurance to the whole value chain. And second, related one, I think you also talked about the issue of, for example, the mobile technology and getting information and to the beneficiaries or to target people, and that access to technology can also be a barrier for accessing insurance. How did you adapt the design of the approach of distributing payouts to ensure that women can receive them?
Thank you, Sven. Maybe on the first question, I think what we try to consider is really the adaptation cycle. So going from this information and sensitization to the reduction of risk and to the risk transfer. This was basically just a conception of a project as such. But of course, we were thinking, well, how do we integrate women in this as well, and not just leave them outside of it and just make it kind of gender neutral without considering them. So I think this really happened by looking at every instrument and every tool you're actually putting in place for a project, and actually trying to look at each of those instruments with a gender lens. So really thinking whenever you're trying to implement, be it a business goal or be it a sensitization material, always take the gender lens and change what you are doing to have really that gender sensitiveness. So it means that basically what we try to do is that to have really that transversal way of looking at, for example, sensitization material. Never just use any sensitization material, but always have this review made with gender approach. So it means that every information, be it the crop calendars or be it the digital messages that were put online, or the sensitization for climate risk insurance, all of those were tested with women. So we always have like a feedback from women before using it properly in the field. And also in every case where it was possible to have women trainers this really made a difference as well, because then you have that direct contact and that direct feeling for what's happening. I think this was really important to have those kind of like really look in a transversal way of how to integrate the gender smart thinking into every approach we're using. But I also think that in terms of we thought of insurance, of course, at the beginning, because we thought that's like the most useful instruments when we look at those severe droughts. But as I was mentioning in the presentation, I think one thing we missed on and that we need to integrate into the project is really in terms of disaster risk finance, insurance is only one bit of the puzzle, and there are some others that really need to be addressed if we want to have that holistic view and that holistic integration of gender. So really looking at how do we have proper saving mechanisms, or how do we have proper access to finance for women as well, to help them reduce the climate risk or have more access to adaptation solutions. That's really one thing we need to work more on, and I would be interested to hear any further stories on that as well. To answer your second question, that's definitely one issue in the south of Madagascar, that in general, well, first of all, network coverage is obviously not so good. And people are also illiterate in most cases, and women even more. So that's a bit of an issue, because even if you think of using an USSD system, for example, where people could just get through with a message and have a premium paid, for example, that doesn't work, because you need to be able to read, for example. So one tool that we used to make it more useful was IVR, interactive voice messages that are pre-recorded and that are sent via phone calls to users, which means either you receive a phone call, or you can also just call the hotline, and then you have those pre-recorded messages that are told with a woman's voice, which apparently works best for women and for men, and really have all the information, for example, about the product be accessible at any time whenever you have network, because it happens that you go to the market and you have network only there. So then you're able to call that hotline and have access to the information about the product, for example. So this was more in terms of sensitization, or at least customer information, to be able to really access that information, to make the payment, or at least receive the payout. Of course, we tried to work with all three operators in the south. So we had discussions with all three, and there was a possibility to pay with any kind of account, be it RTL, Orange, or Mvour, the three that were available. But it's still an issue, as I was mentioning, because sometimes you just don't have network, or you would need to go to the next town to actually have network and be able to pay with it. So that's where we try to have agreements where possible, because there were farmer associations that, for example, one member, the president in most cases, would be able to do the premium payment, for example, for all of the farmers. So we try to have this kind of aggregation mechanism to be able to have still a bit of digital in line, but kind of aggregated. Of course, it's not the best solution. I think there is still some progress to be made, because it would be obviously easier if each woman and each client of a product would have their own phone and would have their own access to network, which means premium payment and payout payment would be made automatically in a very quick way. So that's still something we are looking at. I think some options in the project are already trying to work directly with some of the mobile network operators to see if they can extend coverage, or if they can offer also digital literacy training, which is also important, because it's not that obvious to actually be able to use the mobile money account, for example. So these are some examples of things we're trying to push forward to really make it more available. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I mean, this also shows how important it is to really think about the practicalities of getting information, of getting payouts, not only, let's say, downstream to the target people and to the recipients, but also the other way around, right? To have it really functioning, and that's really important, which I've also seen from other such studies or other work that CARES involved. Which makes me also, build the bridge to Sumaiya, and so I would like to follow up with two questions to you, and maybe if there's something similar, or whether you've encountered similar issues also in the forecast-based finance world related to technology and what Sarah described. That would be just one follow-up, whether there are similar situations or similar challenges and maybe solutions you see, and linked to that also, what are the key elements that changed in your work and in the results that you achieved that led to greater resilience of these communities. So I think, yeah, putting forward to you these both aspects, and we'll be quite, looking forward to hear some of your responses on that.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's really interesting hearing Sarah talk about, having mobile phones or teaching women how to use them, digital literacy, she said. So what we did in our one also, in terms of ensuring that people were receiving timely early warning, we sent voice messages directly to mobile phones as well. This is mobile phones of people. We enlisted numbers from beforehand where, most vulnerable people, and made sure that they were properly dispersed across the locations that we were targeting. So the mobile phones were used to send voice messages to people and using local language, and also in the evenings. So generally one household will have one mobile phone, and during the day it's with the man in the family, it's with the husband or the son who's working outside away from home. So in the evenings when they're home, the mobile phone is also available to the woman at that time as well. So we used to time the messages in a way that it would reach the woman in the evenings, and it's voice messages, it's not messages that you read. So even a person who's not very literate can still hear and basically understand or get the messages from it. In terms of cash distribution, so we went for digital cash distribution as well. So this is mobile money transfers out to communities. We worked with mobile financial services agents to make sure that they were able to reach remote locations particularly. So this is a partnership that we formed with agents. And on top of that, we also kept room for, like, if we had to put hand-to-hand distribution to make sure that some vulnerable households were able to take out the cash early, that was available to people as well, to selected participants. So these are some of the ways that we had tried out different ways of making sure that women were included in how we were implementing the contingency plans as well. There's a lot to be learned. One way, we just embark on our new phase of the project as well. So we're also trying to get identify some new early actions. And this is particularly for the project that I'm working on, and we're trying to bring in the gender aspect. So it's a process. We're still learning how to do it really well. So the difference over here is we have the women's groups, we have youth groups, and we have farmers groups. So we have identified these as people or groups of people who need the training, the understanding from beforehand. So we've tried to ensure that their capacities are, so we work on building their skills, their capacities from beforehand, so they're able to work very fast in that limited time frame. So the forecast gives us a maximum lead time of 15 days. So that's not a lot when it comes to doing all of the different actions. So we find that working with groups earlier on, it allows us to build our capacities more. And also for us, we are able to tap into their needs and understand their priorities throughout the whole process as well. So we're in the hopes that the resulting contingency plans will also really have integrated the voices of the people that are most affected. So it's still something that we're learning how to do better.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I would like to call on Alex. She put a question a bit earlier, and I wonder, given some of your responses may have already provided information on that, she may even be interested in further specifying the questions broadly about designing a climate insurance product and how it can be gender responsive. Alex, do you want to come in?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. So thank you very much to all the speakers today. It's been very interesting, and you're right, Sven. My question has been touched upon. So what I will be doing in the next few months is going into a community where a climate risk insurance product has just been launched, and now they're trying to work out, firstly, if it's gender responsive and how to make it more gender responsive if not. As a fairly new person engaging in this space, I'd really like to learn from your experiences and some of the key lessons that you have for engaging with communities on this topic, so that I can mirror your successes and avoid some of the things you would probably not do again as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone who wants to kick off with a response to that? Any further experience you want to share here?
I can maybe elaborate a tiny bit more. I think I mentioned already a few points. I think in terms of like really working with communities, obviously one of the first thing is when you do focus group to really try to have a separate discussion, first of all, to really get all the issues that might be specific to women and really grasp them a bit better. And in Madagascar, especially, for example, women are not supposed to talk when men are here, so they're really supposed to be doing the speeches, basically. So it's really hard to get voices to be heard. So that's really one of the first issues we encountered is really you always have one of the main leaders or producer association's president speaking, and it's always the same, and you really don't hear what's happening in the other parts of the society. And the second point would be also to take into account the cultural context, obviously. For example, in Madagascar, also dealing with money and who has access, who is actually managing resources, who is deciding how are decisions being made, also in the household, for example. These are points that are very important when you're talking about getting a financial product. Who has the decision? Who's able to make it? And also what we saw is that, for example, when we had single moms or women with deceased husbands, obviously the situation changes and you have very different varieties of households. So then you really have different voices also amongst women when it comes to dealing with money. So that would be a bit my recommendation, to really take into account what's the cultural context and try to get the voices heard that you want to hear actually for your research.
Okay, thank you. Akosita, Sumaiya, anything you want to add?
No, that Sarah very nicely captured it. It's very, I think having that safe space for women to openly voice their concerns is very important. Another thing which we encountered in our project was the need to have, for example, we worked a lot with volunteer groups, right? To quickly be able to mobilize so many actions and mobilize communities and in that short time frame. The volunteer groups tend to be more male. There's a lot more men in these groups. So it's important for us, and we're trying to do this time as well as an improvement, is target women volunteers. Spend a little bit more time getting them included. And it makes a difference having women included in how we are implementing as well. It's easier for us to have their concerns included and also make sure that more women feel comfortable as well to access the different services during these floods or ahead of floods. So that is something that we learned very strongly.
Great, thank you very much. We have another question. Anastasia, maybe you want to come in with your question, please.
Sure. So this is a question to Sarah, and I mean, I've been following your project for the last couple of months, and if not since the start. And I've always been intrigued by the development, but I've wondered, you know, what has the feedback from women been? What has changed for them, and not just for women, particularly before the men and children and other intersectional aspects of this? How has being covered by insurance affected their lives, and especially the whole community, and how has their resilience been improved? Have there been any feedback on that? You know, yeah, just on that particular question.
Yeah, it's a very tricky question to answer, to be honest, especially because the product has been, I mean, it's been only 1 year that we had the product and there was no payout, which, as you know, when you have an insurance product is always very tricky, because one of the hardest part is always, well, sensitization, or at least understanding the product and understanding that it's not something that pays out every year, but sometimes. So that's something where I see a bit of a challenge, to be honest, because even though in the midterm you might be having an increase of resilience or be able to actually resist more to climate shocks because you have the insurance, in the short term, the first feeling that comes to people is always, well, I paid some money and I didn't get anything back. So really, I think for climate risk insurance, that's always the challenge, and that's not specific for women, to be honest, but just really in general for clients of climate risk insurance, that's really difficult. What I can say in terms of increasing resilience, when we look a bit broader, not just at insurance, but also at the techniques to reduce the climate risk and to the preparedness information, the agrometeorological information, and so on. Here we had already some feedback from the first season that was quite interesting. Of course, it's still anecdotal evidence, so I can't say it's like big findings or anything. But we did have some feedback on, for example, how less seeds were used when we were using the adapted techniques, which were helping to actually put less input, so reduce the money invested and get the same production. So these kind of like feedback also on the crop calendars, for example, that by planting, for example, later in the season, they were able to also not waste part of the inputs every year. These were first small feedback where we think there is something really interesting, and it's also something that helps kind of cover, you know, because climate risk insurance is really at the end where you have these extreme events, and then you have those measures that you try to put all the time that kind of protect you in times of small events. Well, the season is starting a bit later, or something happened, but it's not that bad. And it's important to have those measures in place also because they're reducing the risk, and they're also offering solutions in times where you're not going to get a payout because it's not a very big drought, for example, with climate risk insurance. So I think working on all that continuum is super important. Otherwise, you'll be, you know, missing solutions or answers during times that are not so bad, but that are not covered by insurance. I don't know if that helps as an answer.
I'm sure it does. Thank you. I see there's another follow-up question from Alex, and maybe that's also one which also, each of you might be able to share some experience. Sometimes when trying to promote taking a gender lens in projects, we are faced with questions such as, why is this necessary? Vulnerability is seen as the same across the community. What is your response when you get these questions? Why is taking a gender lens so important, and how do you explain this to others? And maybe just adding also from Claire's experience, I think that's definitely a very important point, and also shows that applying a gender lens is of course more than specifically, for example, capacity building for women community members or women stakeholders. It's an essential part, but we also have some projects, for example, where it's specifically about, engaging men and boys in that same discussion as a part of sensitization and also sharing and developing various perspectives. So yeah, but just to short point from mine, but I would like to give it back to you to share your experience on which answers work, and how do you convince, whether it's a business sector, whether it's government stakeholders who are expected to support certain measures, or whether it's just a community level. Who wants to start with that?
I can give it a try.
Okay.
I think we had some really interesting discussions actually just last week with producers, and we asked that question. Well, how do you see it? What do you think it's important that we consider also the women in that group? And I think the answers were quite interesting, because they were really quite aware that, well, in the south of Madagascar, really the impact of climate change is really stronger on women. So they knew, well, in the end, it's also because the distribution of roles is very unbalanced. So they have to take care of getting the water, they have to take care of the kids, they have to take care of feeding the families. So they were quite aware that having a big drought, for example, would impact more the women. So that was very interesting that they were aware of that. They wouldn't really do anything to change it, but they knew, well, it's true, if there's a drought, they're going to be more impacted. So I think at that level, at least at really the micro level, and discussing with producers, they had that awareness of, well, it's true, maybe we should do more for women because they are impacted more. Maybe not in terms of production, for example. Obviously, the groundnut production wouldn't really change. It's the same type of impact. But in the daily lives, you do have some secondary impacts that have to be reflected. Where we struggled, I think, is really the government level, or a bit more regional authorities, because there sometimes it's really hard to make people aware of that type of issues. I mean, they might be aware of it, but they say, yeah, but we just, it's just, they see it as a whole, like just the producers, and they don't want to differentiate in between and have that discussion around specific measures, or which doesn't mean the others are going to be left behind, but it's really having at one point specific aspects or a specific gender lens. And this is something where I don't really have an answer, but I know this has been a struggle with regional authorities. So yeah, if anyone has an idea how to deal with this, it's always contextual, of course, and it's a question of intercultural discussions, but this is something we've been struggling with.
We have a few minutes left, not much, but yeah, inviting Akosita or Sumaiya for any further addition to that, or any other almost final remarks you want to share on the discussion we've had.
Yeah, thank you. I think why gender is not so much of a big question in my experience in Bangladesh. I think the need to address women's need is realized, it's understood, but how to do it is something that we're still struggling with. How to meaningfully have women's perspectives integrated into the work that we do is really challenging. And also have women in leadership positions, in meaningful decision-making positions, is something that we struggle with. It's difficult, I think, also because of existing cultural norms for women to step out of their homes and really engage in all of these community level activities where they're having to play a leadership role, or take active roles within their community for response or early action. But in saying that, it's not that there is no willingness from women. When we were trying to enlist volunteers, we had certain criteria which made it difficult for women to come in as volunteers. The education was too high, or we expected women or volunteers to have certain literacy level, which was challenging for girls especially to be included. So we needed to revisit these criteria, make it a little bit more flexible. We had women come in and amazing results. I mean, the type of mobilization, the type of responses we get from our women workers and volunteers is very different from how we get it from the men. So when you see the results, then it's easier to explain why you need the woman included as in playing active roles in the community.
Okay, thank you. Which also probably points to the need to document such experience, right? And that should be part of I mean, not only of your general evaluation of projects, but of ongoing work to be able to document it and share it in different languages as well, depending on local context. So before I give a very short kind of closing words and summary, I would like to give Akosita the final possibility to share some reflections on the previous hour and what you've heard and learned and what you would like to share with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sven. If I could just add on to what Sarah and Sumaiya had mentioned, in the Pacific, you know, insurance is, especially in the disaster-related insurance, is still a new thing in the Pacific, and you know, I guess we really need to create a lot of awareness so that you know, our people, especially the women, are aware that, you know, there are also you know, instruments that are available to help them post disasters. But from the research, what we have noted is that you know, there are data gaps, particularly sex disaggregated data, and for this, for insurance to be successful in the Pacific, if you were to consider gender issues, then I think it's important that the Pacific Island countries or our countries in the region collect sex disaggregated data. So I think that's a key issue that we need to address in the Pacific.
Great, thank you. So yeah, let's come to the conclusion of this. I also don't see any further questions in the chat. Thank you very much for sharing all your insights. I think it was really interesting, the different 3-country examples and the really like very practical also suggestions and recommendations you can draw from that. I think maybe 3 points I see as particularly important. On the one hand, to understand the need for a more comprehensive approach, both in terms of analyzing and understanding what are the challenges that the people locally have, which we would try to cover with whatever kind of solution, and like, for example, entering this only with an insurance perspective and not having a wider look usually doesn't succeed, and may also be, let's say, misleading in terms of even if you're about designing an insurance product, it may be misleading. So I think a comprehensive perspective is important. The second is, of course, really a full-fledged approach to integrating gender, so to say, not only, I mean, at stages of analysis, of talking to the audience / clients / beneficiaries, and really thinking this through, that it makes a difference in all of these different levels of the value chain of the product design and of aspects like payouts, and so it's really important not to just to see the integration of gender lens as something which, I don't know, maybe happens at the very start or when you're designing a feasibility study or anything, but you really have to apply it throughout the work in consultations locally. And then, of course, I think also the point about documenting those aspects, documenting also what has worked, what hasn't worked, to be able to tell others, and tell others how important it is to integrate the gender lens, but also to really understand which very practical approaches can make a difference, as we see that it's not only enough to just say, let's integrate gender, but really understand how to. And this may also differ a bit from country to country, as we've also seen, I think. So let me conclude with that. I'm not sure whether there will be any final words from the organizing secretariat colleagues, but I thank you very much for your insightful presentations and the good conversation we've had. I really enjoyed it, and we'll take a lot from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sven and kind speakers. That was a very interesting conversation today. Greatly appreciate it. Just a final word for everybody. The Centre of Excellence on Gender Smart Solutions will be fully launched at COP on November 9th. So this is a very exciting development for InsuResilience and the Centre of Excellence and all the stakeholders involved. Then to finally close, I would invite you to just close this browser and main plenary session, where we have the final session for the InsuResilience Annual Forum 2021, where we will hear a short message from Mr. Amal Krishna Mandal from Bangladesh, Mr. Achim Steiner of the UNDP, and then a short conversation between Dirk Reinhardt and Astrid Zwick to close. So thank you very much.
Thank you much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.